A while ago I had an idea. What if I remake Yume Nikki in 3D? And not just make a PC game, but make it work on PlayStation 1. And so I did, and in November 2025 I released a small demo called Yume Nikki PS, which you can download on itch.io. And this little demo got a lot more attention and praise than I could ever anticipate. In this video I'll tell you how I develop PS1 games and how I made a polished and complex demo of Yume Nikki PS in just 1.5 months. For 1.5 years now I've been developing a game which runs on PS1. The game I was developing was more of a test for my engine and not a serious project with real content yet. Sorry, Porsche fans, you won't be in the real game. For quite some time I was feeling a bit anxious about starting to work on the real game content, and I wanted to make something small but very polished with my engine to see if it can be used to make real games. I was a fan of Yume Nikki for a long time, and for years I dreamed of remaking a portion of it in 3D for fun. So I thought, why not do it as a small test project? And that's how the development of Yume Nikki PS started. But wait, you might ask, how the hell do you make games for PS1? Well, let me give you a high-level overview of how I do it. Someday I want to make a more in-depth video about my process, and this will be just a short overview to not make this video too long. Think of the PlayStation 1 as a very limited computer from 1994. What makes PS1 very different from modern PCs is that it loads the software from CDs. It also has no operating system. When you normally compile your code on a PC, the compiler creates an executable containing machine code native for your CPU. For example, x86-64 or ARM. The PS1 CPU is based on the MIPS R3000 processor, which uses MIPS 1 instruction set architecture. And here's the cool thing. Modern GCC still supports this processor architecture, and you can still compile PS1 games with it. On Linux, you need to install the GCC mipsl Linux GNU package, and that's all you need to compile programs which can run on PS1. Back in the 90s, pretty much all PS1 developers used an official SDK called SciQ that was developed by SN Systems Limited and Psygnosis. It was relatively high level and didn't expose low-level PS1 hardware details much. The games were usually written in C programming language. SciQ also had a library called libjs, which was even higher level, sort of a game engine, which made it even easier to write games for the PS1. The official SDK also had many helper tools and converters bundled with it, to make the development even easier. I don't use SciQ for my projects, and I don't recommend using it for making homebrew these days. Sony probably doesn't care about you using it for non-commercial stuff, but might get mad if you release a commercial game, because SciQ is a proprietary code which was never publicly released. SciQ is closed source, so you can't inspect functions to see how they really work, unless you reverse engineer them from assembly. And also its API design is very outdated, at times very confusing and overall not very pleasant to work with. There are other ways of doing PS1 development which are much better. You can go bare metal and make your own SDK pretty much from scratch. For my PS1 projects I use SDK called SciQO or Psycho. It's a modern PS1 SDK written in C++ by Nicholas Noble. It's mostly a low-level wrapper around some of the hardware's basic functionality, but it also contains a bunch of helpers to make the process of the development less painful. Compared to SciQ, you are mostly on your own. You need to write all of your engine and game code pretty much from scratch. Note that despite its name, SciQO is not related to SciQ at all. It's written from scratch and doesn't use any of Sony's proprietary code. This is good. because it means that games developed with PsyQO are pretty much in the clear from a legal standpoint. I've been using PsyQO for a long time and collaborated with Nicholas closely to improve it, as I discovered many bugs and limitations while I was using it. I believe that PsyQO is incredibly good and stable now. The only major thing it lacks is memory card support. Nicholas has also written a bunch of handy tools for PS1 development. For example, with the CD authoring tool, you can bundle your assets and game executable into an ISO, which you can then burn on a CD-R and run on your PS1. Note that you need to have a way to run unlicensed software on your console to do it. You can do it via FreePSX boot, mod chip, or a cheat cartridge. You still can't make a CD-R, which would trick the PS1 copy protection in 2026, but at least with methods like FreePSX boot or using a cheat cartridge, you can run Homebrew without doing any hardware modifications to your PS1. There's another way to run Homebrew on PS1. I have a second PlayStation 1 with X-Station installed, so I don't need to burn hundreds of CDs thankfully. I can just put the ISO file on the SD card and then run my game from it. I mostly run my game in DuckStation PS1 emulator while I develop it, and only occasionally run the game on the PS1 itself. DuckStation emulates PS1 extremely well, so I rarely see discrepancies between the emulator and the real hardware. But sometimes I do, and it's not very fun. Some of the bugs I have encountered took me literal days to solve. Okay, what about the game assets that you put inside the ISO? Well, it's complicated. PS1 can't work with any normal image, audio and model formats. For sound effects, you can't just use WAV files. The PS1 sound processor can only play back samples compressed with a specific ADPCM algorithm. Thankfully, there's an ADPCM encoder written by Nicholas, which can convert your WAV files to the format that PS1 understands. Next, the textures. No, you can't use JPEGs or PNGs. The texture data, which you need to upload to PS1 VRAM, needs to be either 16-bit raw color or index color. I have written a custom tool that converts my PNG textures to the TIM format, which is also used in PsyQ. It's a pretty simple format, which can store all the formats that PS1 VRAM supports. Note that my texture converter can also quantize textures to the needed amount of colors and can downscale images as well. I use ImageMagick for quantization and other image processing. Next, the models and levels. And you guessed it. While you technically could write an OPC or GLTF parser for PS1, parsing models from these formats would be extremely slow on the PS1 CPU. It's much more efficient to store models and levels in a custom binary format. I implemented a Blender exporter which converts models and levels directly from the blend file into my custom binary format. It also exports skeletal animations stored in the files. I also created a tool which makes texture atlases for each level, so that I don't need to manually position all the textures in VRAM. I previously needed to do it, and it was extremely time consuming. Implementing all this took a lot of time, but the result is extremely easy to use. I can just modify the blend file, run the shell script which builds the assets, and put them in the ISO and instantly see all the changes in the game. And now let's finally see how I developed Yume Nikki PS. Yume Nikki is an indie game first released in 2004 by a mysterious Japanese developer called Kikiyama. In the game, you explore the dream worlds of a girl named Madotsuki. In this world, you collect effects, which change your appearance and give you different abilities. With these abilities, you can interact with various NPCs and get to new worlds which you couldn't access before. I love Yume Nikki a lot. I like its atmosphere, its aesthetics, its surreal worlds, and all the little details and care put into the game. I love how mysterious it is, and how it breaks many video game conventions and always surprises you. You never know what to expect from it. When I got the idea to make a reimagining of Yume Nikki for PS1, I set a simple goal for myself: make Madotski's house and 2 dream worlds. The scope looked small enough, and I thought that I could do it in 2 or 3 weeks. After all, you just work on the game and collect a bunch of effects, right? Well, I was very off with my estimate. As you'll see, there's much more that I had to do. I started by modeling Madotski's house. I used Yume Nikki's pixel art for the textures, which looked pretty good on PS1. I initially wanted to redraw all the textures and make them higher definition, but this was one of the things that I had to pass on to finish the demo in a reasonable amount of time. When I started the project, I didn't start coding everything from scratch. I used my cat game code as a base, so initially my cat character was running around Madotski's house. The way I reduced the code was by putting a lot of if-def statements into it. Basically, an if-def in C++ lets you choose the portion of the code which gets compiled into your executable. So, instead of copying thousands of lines of code from a cat game and modifying the copy, I just inserted a bunch of if-def Yume Nikki and reused big portions of my code base. Reusing my code that way was nice, because when I fixed the bugs in Yume Nikki PS and added new features to my engine, all of that was also applied to my main project as well. After I did the apartment, I started working on Madotski's model. I was very anxious about getting her model just right, as I'm still not a very good modeler. Eventually I just started modeling a temporary model, but it started looking pretty nice after a while. As always, sometimes the best way to get over your anxiety is to just pretend that you are doing a temporary or throwaway thing, and just keep improving it. Don't try to make it perfect on the first try. There's almost always time to improve your work later. Madotski's 3D design was inspired by these models by Colin Armistead. I was also inspired by the work of an animator who goes by the name Gobo, whose animations I absolutely adore. Once I did the first iteration of Madotski's model, the project started looking nice. So I decided to announce it to the world. I had a few of my tweets going viral before, so I expected to get some attention, but I didn't expect to get so much hype when I announced the project in its rough state. It wasn't just a small learning project now. I had to do my best and make something that people will find enjoyable, and this is partly why the project took much longer than I anticipated. A lot of the comments about the announcement were very positive, but there were some somewhat sarcastic comments which struck me in particular though. These ones. The initial model had a mouse, and so Madotski kinda looked like Frisk from Undertale indeed. Realizing my mistake, I removed the mouse and redrawn her eyes a bit differently. Once I did that, the model became much cuter. Eventually I did a lot of adjustments to make the model even better, and I also rigged and animated it. I especially like how I managed to animate Madotski's hair, to make the animations more interesting. I also modeled the balcony, which looked pretty atmospheric with the fog. One goal I set for myself was to do everything as close to the original as possible. I wanted to include every single thing that you could do in the original game in the areas which were included in the demo. I didn't want people to try to do something and get disappointed that the thing they were looking for is not present in the demo. One of these things was Nasu. It's a fun little game that you can play in Madotski's apartment. The game is pretty simple. You can walk left and right and jump to catch a falling eggplant. Should be easy to re-implement in a few hours, right? Well, there are other things. There's a bonus eggplant that sometimes appears and jumps around. There's a mechanic which gives you extra points when you catch 2 eggplants at the same time. There's also a cheat code, which makes your head look like an eggplant and spawns bonus eggplants with a higher probability, and so on. Programming and polishing this minigame took 2 whole days in the end. And then I started to work on Nexus. The floor pattern was pretty interesting to model. I couldn't just put a huge image in the PS1 VRAM, since it wouldn't fit there. So I noticed that this pattern is pentagonal, and this has helped me save a lot of VRAM space by only using a small texture for the floor. I also added lights on top of doors which you can enter, to highlight which worlds are available in the demo. For the dream sequence, I needed to do a pixelization fade effect. The way it's done is somewhat tricky, because PS1 can't do full screen shaders. I basically copied the last drawn frame into the upper right corner of VRAM, and then repeatedly scale it down in another part of VRAM. Then I stretch the resulting pixelated texture to the currently drawn frame buffer. The fade-in effect is the same thing, but done in reverse. I also implemented the ability to sit in the chair and ride it in the dream. I especially love how the cutscene where you start riding the chair turned out. The iris effect that appears when you sit in the chair or enter the dream world was also tricky to implement, since PS1 doesn't have a stencil buffer, so I just draw a bunch of triangles on top to obscure the image, and it works pretty fine. I learned about this effect from a wonderful PS1 game called Dr. Slump. Now that I was done with Madotsky's apartment, it was time to start working on the first dream world. The first dream world I chose to make was Block World. It's just a bunch of blocks, should be easy to do, right? Well, first of all, the level is huge. It's also in the isometric perspective, which meant that I couldn't just parse the original map data and create a 3D model from it. So I had to count the block sizes and distances between them by hand and model them one by one. I marked all the shapes I've done on the map to not miss any of them, and it was also tricky to figure out how the shapes were positioned relative to each other, so drawing a bunch of lines in perspective helped. The modeling process took 3 whole days, and by the end of it, the map looked like a madman has scribbled all over it. The resulting level was style perfect. Once I modeled the whole level, I encountered a huge problem. The resulting mesh was so big that I started running out of memory on PS1 while trying to load the level. The PS1 RAM is very small, just 2 MB. Out of these 2 MB, I only have around 1 MB free to use for gameplay assets and objects. The other megabyte is occupied by things like draw lists, static game data, the compiled game code itself, and so on. The block world level mesh was 800 KB, and I only had 400 KB of memory left, so the game crashed once I tried to load it. So I needed to compress the level mesh a lot better. After some thinking, I came up with a nice solution. Instead of storing the model's faces in my custom 3D model format, where every quad face takes 36 bytes, I made a much simpler format for the block meshes. For each face, I only store its single point and assume that its size is 1 by 1 meters. I also store the face color and its direction, basically the side of the cube which the face represents. With this new format, each face of the block mesh world occupies only 10 bytes instead of 36 bytes. And so I have finally managed to bring block world size from 800 kilobytes to 184 kilobytes, and the crisis was averted. Everything fit into RAM nicely, and I even had quite a lot of free memory space for other things now. I also realized that I could pre-calculate the lighting by slightly changing each face's base color depending on the side of the cube. If it was the top side, the color was made lighter. If it was a face on the sides or the bottom, the color became darker. This fake lighting made the block world level look a lot better, and it was now much easier to navigate in it. After that, I added the first effect, head and scarf. At this point, I also spent a lot of time working on the status and effects menus. In fact, they are pixel-perfect recreations of Yume Nikki's and RPG Maker menus. Measuring all the pixel offsets and writing the code for the UI took many hours. And speaking of menus, the instruction screens took a lot of time to implement as well. I even created a new screen which shows the PS1 gamepad controls. I have also implemented the first NPC, Mafurako, which is just Madotsuki's model with head and scarf, but with Madotsuki herself hidden. I wrote a simple AI for her to make her wander around and teleport you to a predetermined set of the points on the map. I also needed to add level background music now. I initially wanted to remake it as sequence music, but I eventually decided to simply record the tracks from the original game and make them loop. The PS1 sound processor has only 512 kilobytes of memory available for storing samples, so I had to compress the music and make it mono. Most of the songs in the original game are pretty short loops, so it was perfect for making the music files small. I didn't want to bother with audio streaming from the CD, since it can be problematic on old PS1 CD drives. Another problem with audio CD streaming is that if the music is streamed from the CD, it can't loop perfectly, because the drive has to sync backwards, and sometimes it takes seconds to arrive at the correct sector. But if the samples are stored in the SPU RAM, they can be looped perfectly. The rest of the block world was easy. I added the dudes that float beneath the floor. I added the toilet and the cutscene when you enter it. I also modded the gate to the white desert. Sorry Monoko and Manoe fans, you can't go in there in the demo. One thing that I also added at this point was the warp behavior. In Yume Nikki, once you reach the end of the map, you get teleported as if the map was infinite. But first, we need to talk about parallel universes. It works the same way in 3D, and the distance fog prevents you from noticing the moment when the teleportation happens. And so, the level was done, and it was time to move on to the next level, the Snow World. The Snow World was very simple to do compared to the Block World. Recreating the level was pretty easy, it's just a bunch of igloos and some trees. I actually added more trees and hills to make the level more interesting. The distances between the objects in my 3D recreation were much bigger than in the original, because of the more realistic scale I chose, so I needed to add some new objects to make the level less empty. But it was still very easy to get lost in the level. In the initial version of the demo, it was even a bigger problem. The fog distance was way too small because of the performance and amount of polygons I could draw. I did some clever tricks to optimize the level drawing and managed to greatly increase the view distance, which made navigating Snow World much easier. However, as I saw on many streams later, people still got lost a lot. They walked a few steps forward, and then they kept turning in one direction, and eventually did a 360-degree turn. Then they'd stumble upon something they recognized and started doing the same thing again, but sometimes in a different direction. This made me realize that it's kinda hard to navigate such levels in 3D without the map or a compass. It's much easier to navigate Yume Nikki's levels in 2D, since it's easier to keep a mental map of the level and know the exact direction you're going just by looking at the screen. By the way, the fog used in Snow World and the balcony is actually the exact same technique that was used in Silent Hill 1. If you want to know how it works, check out my video, which goes in depth about how this effect is achieved on PS1 and how this effect pushes PS1 to its limits. To finish the level, I had to model the 3 NPCs which you can meet there: Kamakurako, Snow Woman or Yuki Onna, and Toriningen. Toriningen and Yuki Onna took approximately 6 hours to model each. I think the models turned out pretty good. One thing I'm particularly proud of is how I did the hair alpha trick to make Toriningen's hair more interesting. She also looks at you if you get close, which I think looks pretty neat. Kamakurako was much easier to model, as it was just a recolor of Madotsuki's model with a different hairstyle. I also implemented a cool transformation into a snowman. With all levels and models being done, it was time to do some final polish. I added a little cinematic that plays when you start playing Nasu. I also added cool glow effect to the TV by adding a bunch of semi-transparent quads to the model. I programmed the Kalimba event, which sometimes happens when you turn the TV on while dreaming. I also made Madotsuki do a little dance during it. I also made the bed bounce for fun. And I implemented the ability to drop effects in the Nexus. I also added the photo mode, which can be used to make cool screenshots. It has a pose function, which makes Madotsuki turn to the camera and strike the peace pose. And I just had to implement Toriningen posing for the camera too. Another fun thing that I did was changing the PS1 boot logo. The PlayStation logo model is not a part of the PS1 BIOS, and it's actually part of the licensed part of the ISO file. Check out this cool video by Yume Nikki to learn more about the PS1 boot process. So, by modifying this part of the ISO, you can change the model and the license text to whatever you want. A while ago, I did some reverse engineering and figured out how to do it. With this incredible power, I could do things like this. So, with Yume Nikki PS, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to add UBOA there? I also found out that it's possible to insert hiragana in the license text, so I replaced it with the significance of which might be familiar to Yume Nikki fans. Here's how the boot sequence looked in the final version. While I was developing the game, I had a to-do list on my desk, which helped me stay focused and see how many things I had to do before I could release the demo. Unfortunately, this list grew into another list. But still, it kept me sane by seeing the scope was somewhat defined and I was getting closer and closer to the release. I also decided not to playtest the game with other people. I was anxious that they wouldn't like some parts of it, and I would have to spend many more weeks on the demo. By not letting others playtest the game before the public release, I was putting myself at risk by having the game riddled with bugs. But thankfully it all worked out and it was pretty stable overall. When I was 100% done with the content, I spent a few days dealing with some of the worst bugs. And then I spent a few hours creating a pretty cover for the game. And actually printed it. With everything being done, I spent a few hours creating an itch.io page and another few hours creating a trailer for the game. And have finally hit post. I knew that the demo's release wouldn't fly under the radar, since many of my tweets about it went viral. People were extremely excited for the demo, and during the week before the demo's release, my tweets got 1 million views in a week, which is just insane. But I still didn't know how people would react to the game itself. I knew that it looked pretty good, and the PS1 aesthetic added 3 extra vibe points, but I didn't know if the game would be as satisfying as the original. I wasn't sure if Yume Nikki fans would find my work good enough, since with the game as niche and called as Yume Nikki, you'd expect to find a lot of very dedicated and opinionated fans who might have found my reimagined lacking, unsatisfying or even offensive. However, I started getting a lot of incredibly positive comments, and just minutes after the release, people were already playing my game on Twitch and releasing YouTube videos about it, and they all liked it a lot.
Creí que era una cinemática. ¡Wow! ¿Ven eso? ¡Damn! Lo pueden ver, se ve increíble, amigo, no puede ser. Esto...
¡Wow!これは 3D にして映えるエリアだよね。雰囲気は、すごくいいですね。
It was my first experience of seeing someone play something I made on stream, and it was also my first experience interacting with streamers as well. I didn't want the streamers to feel pressured by announcing myself in the chat if I catch their stream as they were just booting the game, so I didn't announce my arrival until they had some time to express how they felt about it and whether they liked it or not. And then I posted, "Hey, I made this game," in the chat. I didn't expect streamers to react with such amazement and joy.
And then now it's like, oh, you're the person who was streaming TF2 and forgot they had a strange model. Oh, yo, it's no, Elias, I can't be talking about this when you come in. Don't worry about Pyro TF2 inflation models. That's not important. Hi, Dev. Thank you for playing the demo. Dev, fucking good. This is so good. This is so ridiculously good. It's crazy. It's fucking crazy. I cannot believe you pulled this off in 1.5 months. This is fucking god tier. This is ridiculous.
It was cool seeing people run Yume Nikki PS on many things, not just on PlayStation 1, but on PS2, PS Vita, and even on mobile phones and iPads. It's interesting to think that a PS1 game is essentially more portable than any PC game. Even when many years pass, my PS1 games will still run on PS1 emulators on future platforms. I didn't expect to see many people to love something I made. It seemed like the more enthusiastic the person playing was about Yume Nikki, the more they loved the demo. And then something cool happened. I saw that Vinny Vinesauce had started a stream with a curious title. I didn't know if he would play my game on the stream or not, but with my game going viral on Twitter and the 2D to 3D thing matching exactly what I did, it felt like my game could be featured. I became extremely nervous, because just a couple of hours before Vinny's stream started, another person streamed my game and found a few game-breaking bugs caused by my latest changes to the game. Seeing my game crashing on Vinny's stream while thousands of people were watching would have been pretty devastating. It was 4 AM, I was exhausted from the work, and the segment still didn't start, so I went to sleep. But I kept randomly waking up and checking out what was going on the stream. Finally, the segment ended, and I saw that my game didn't make it after all. The next day, I went to the unofficial VOD channel and scrolled through it. There were many cool games that Winnie played that day, but it seemed like he didn't play Yume Nikki PS after all. I felt kinda stupid about panicking so much about nothing. But then, someone messaged me and said that Winnie has played my game in fact. I rushed back to the VOD and have finally found it. I couldn't believe it. I was a big fan of Winnie's streams for years, and having him play something I made was incredible. And what's more, here's what he thought about it.
This is cool. This is really cool, actually.
At this point I knew I had finally made it as a game developer. The game didn't crash during the stream, but somehow Vinny found the debug menu by accident. And from the dozens of Yume Nikki PS streams I watched, he was the only one to do it. It's L1, square, triangle, by the way. A few days later, another legend and a favorite streamer of mine, Joel, played the game as well. And not just in one, but in 2 streams.
Right. That's Matsuoka. Oh, okay. Okay, tilt like this, and then you can... This is fucking cool. Okay. Yeah! Yeah! That's what I'm talking about! Woo! Okay. Okay. Alright.
Seeing Joel enjoy the game and play it for so long made me very proud of my work. In 2 weeks that followed, since the demo was released, I decided to port it to PC. I wanted the game to be more accessible to people without having to mess with PS1 emulation. Plus, I wanted to make my codebase future-proof, because if I wanted to release my PS1 games on Steam, I probably wouldn't be able to just drop an ISO wrapped in an emulator. Porting to PC was a fun experience and took about 3 weeks. I basically made a mini PS1 emulator, but that's a topic for another video, since there are many things that went into the process. Porting to PC also made it possible for me to make a browser version. Now you didn't even need to download the game, you can just play it from your browser. Yume Nikki's fanbase has accepted my game to the extent I still can't believe. I have received incredible praise on itch, YouTube and on Twitter. I'm incredibly thankful to the people who played the game and wrote these wonderful comments. Thank you. A lot of people also found Yume Nikki through my game, which made me realize that Yume Nikki was still a very niche game. I hope that my demo was a nice little preview of what Yume Nikki is like, and the game got new fans when they experienced the original version. A couple of wonderful people even did fan art of Yume Nikki PS, which is just unbelievable. Making this demo taught me a lot. I realized that you can fit a lot of polish and complexity even into a small part of your game. All these little details I noticed made me appreciate the original game even more and motivated me to aim for the same amount of polish in my own projects. After spending 3 months working on Yume Nikki PS, I was kind of burned out. A small 2-week project spiraled into something much bigger than I expected, but it was so worth it. For now, I have returned to working on my original game. Remember, this is what Yume Nikki PS was initially meant to be, a small demo project for me to become a better game developer and test my engine. I hope that my original game would eventually evolve into something cool and would bring as much joy to people as Yume Nikki PS did. I'll try my best to make it a novel, charming and enjoyable experience. And someday I might return to Yume Nikki PS once again and add some new effects and areas for people to explore. In the meantime, don't forget to check out the demo I released on itch.io and see if all this hard work was worth it in the end. And please, play Yume Nikki if you never did before. It's one of the greatest games ever created. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments and subscribe to get random cool gameplay videos of my PS1 game from time to time. Or, if you want to follow my work more closely, follow me on Twitter, since that's where I post my day-to-day work. I hope that you found the video interesting. Thank you for watching.